Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Kate Powers, President of Marine Conservation League, and on behalf of the League, I'd like to welcome you to MCL's four-part workshop series, Ranching in the Park, Not by Accident. Marine Conservation League was formed in 1934. As an environmental organization, Marine Conservation League supports ranching in the pastoral zone of the Point Reyes National Seashore. It has a long history of doing so, going back to the days of our founders and continuing through the time of the formation of the seashore. Admittedly, MCL's focus on West Marin has changed over time depending on the interests of its board members. Not too long ago, two of MCL's directors, Judy Teichman and rancher Sally Gale, renewed MCL's focus on environmental issues in West Marin and formed MCL's Agricultural Land Use Committee. The seed for these workshops spun out of the work of that committee and was planted early last spring by MCL board member David Lewis and Ag Land Use co-chair Sally Gale, as a way for Marine Conservation League and the public to become informed in preparation for the park's Ranch Comprehensive Management Plan and the environmental assessment. These workshops are a product of Sally and David's work. MCL directors Judy Teichman managed the outreach and the publicity for the workshops, and Vicki Nichols set up the venues and refreshments. I'd like to extend a sincere thank you to each of you. As we begin, historian Dewey Livingston has characterized Point Reyes National Seashore as a three-piece mosaic of wilderness, natural areas, and working landscapes. This workshop series will focus on the working landscapes part of the mosaic, how agriculture has historically shaped the landscapes of the seashore, and how the seashore has shaped agriculture, how they have evolved together over time, how the integrity of the natural areas are maintained, and what the future may hold for the next generations of ranchers in the park. The intent of these workshops is to move from general impressions about these topics to a more specific understanding about the important issues facing this historic and beloved part of our county. David will be the moderator and host for each of these workshops. David?
This has been a long time in the coming, and so we want to get going and get you engrossed in the topic and get your thoughts and ideas coming forward. And I can't think of a better person to help us set the stage for our community, for the National Seashore, for our ranching community, than Supervisor Steve Kinsey. So we've asked him, really in his victory lap, to come and just say a few words about the purpose. A former MCL director, if I remember that correctly. So just for a few minutes, we just appreciate you being here, Supervisor Kinsey. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thanks to all of you for making time this evening, and I hope for all four of these fine events to better understand ranching in our county, ranching in the park, and the challenges, but also the many successes. I do want to start by thanking the Marin Conservation League. I did have a privilege to serve on the board of the league for 6 years, and in many ways it really inspired me and trained me and informed me and prepared me for the responsibilities I've had for 20 years now as a county supervisor. So thanks to MCL for your incredible history of stewardship and devotion to the core values of our community. In terms of this is a powerful subject, and I feel very committed to the agriculture in our county, as do many who stood before me and who will follow me as well. It's a defining element of our county in terms of our history and our culture, in terms of the land use and the landscape that's been created and preserved in West Marin, and even an important part of our economy. One of 5 targeted industries that the Board of Supervisors has specifically set our sights on to protect, invest in, and to nourish. This didn't happen by accident, that we even still have the opportunity, not only in the park, but throughout our county, to have agriculture being sustained and in some respects flourishing. And in fact, interestingly, when I took office 20 years ago with the excellent work of the UC Ag Extension and Dave's predecessor, David Lewis's predecessor, we were standing with ranchers out at Walker Creek Ranch saying, the future for agriculture depends upon diversification, and tremendous diversification has taken place. Some of the legends of our dairy industry are here tonight. Some of the legends of our cheese industry are here. We have olives, we have farm crops. Many of our ranches have gotten into organic row cropping in addition. Obviously Warren Weber, the very first certified organic ranch in California. So we have leaders who have held on. It's no surprise, but it's been hard work. Last week I was in Orange County. There's no oranges left in Orange County. There's no orchards left in Santa Clara. The dairies of the East Bay have disappeared, but in Marin we've kept our agriculture strong. And it's because people like yourselves have come to events like this, have learned, have recognized the multiple values of agriculture and land preservation, and have fought for decades to keep our agriculture here. So for all those reasons, I think I would just close by pointing out that Marin Conservation League stands in a circle with many strong organizations. The first agricultural land trust in the country, Marin Agricultural Land Trust. Rick LaFranchi is here, our past president. We have the strong resource conservation districts. Several of our resource conservation districts members are here. Bob Giacomini, Steve Dowdy, there may be others. Sally Gale, yes. And so that resource conservation district looks out for the resource of the land, but it talks in the language of the rancher. Those are the ways we've done it. We have our Farm Bureau, the Ag Institute that many people think of as the farmer's market in Marin, an ag commissioner who had the foresight to come up with a non-lethal predation program around sheep, and more recently our organic certification program locally, the Marin Carbon Project that's really setting the stage for the future around climate change and using our agricultural lands as a force to push back against greenhouse gases in our country. So for many, many reasons, it's exciting to be here tonight. I look forward to learning with the rest of you. As I said, I encourage us all to not just take our run around this evening in the park, but to think about how agriculture is an important and a continuing interest for all of us in Marin. Thanks for this opportunity to be here tonight with you. Thanks, David.
So this is a 4-part series, and I'm going to briefly help you know what's coming ahead, and then we're going to get right into the first installment. Tonight is a history lesson, and I'll get into that in more detail. We're really lucky for the 3 panelists that we have tonight to help us with that. But really, how did the park come to be? How did this Point Reyes National Seashore come here and wind up here and be part of us and us part of it? The second one that'll happen 2 weeks from now out at the Nicasio School, if you notice, they rotate. Every other Tuesday, they're here, and then they're at Nicasio, and then they're back here, and then we're at Nicasio again. The second one is at Nicasio. That's a day in the life of a rancher. We're going to have a dairy producer and a beef rancher tell you what they do. We're also going to have a dairy economist and a ranch manager that does ranch business plans, help give insight into the economy and the ins and outs and day-to-day life of the income and the revenue and the costs to run a ranch, and the other business decisions around environmental stewardship will be brought up. But that'll lead into the third session, where we'll really focus on how a place like the national park has multiple mandates, and how on the pastoral zone, these ranch lands, things like cultural resources, natural resources, ag viability, all can be managed together. And so that installment builds, as you can see, we build on each one. And then the fourth one is a chance to visit with the next generation. And we'll have panels and presentations from the farm families about their hopes and aspirations going forward. And all of it's organized around the pending Ranch Comprehensive Management Plan coming out. And helping us all get more informed, so when it does come out, we can participate in its discussion and its review and its approval in the end. So hopefully that works well for you. You can see the 4 installments. I really just want to get on to the history lesson because I've had the privilege of listening to these 3 folks. We've had several conference calls to get ready for tonight. And as we bring them up, you'll see why they've been chosen to help us with this discussion. Tonight, we're going to do a little bit of a get back and forth, give and take between the 3 of them, and then eventually we'll open it up to full question and answers from you. So for the first hour and a half, they're going to make some presentations, and they're going to have some discussions with each other. And they're going to do that around 3 time periods. They're first going to explore the park or the seashore in terms of a concept and where that concept came from for the national park and for us here in Marin. Then they're going to move into the defining of the Point Reyes National Seashore, the legislation that put it in place, how the different community members move through deciding what it should look like, and that's that defining period. And then we're going to move into an implementing period. How and when properties were bought and leases were put in place, and the details around how the park staff and the park leadership worked with the ranching community on what's known as the pastoral land. So let me first just make brief introductions for the 3 of them, and then we'll start off with the first presentation. So we've got John Hart, a noted author here in San Rafael and in Marin County, a really lifelong, as I've come to learn and gotten some good tips, lifelong backpacker and mountaineer, really. But also 2-time Commonwealth Club Silver Award winner for California for his books. So I hope that speaks well to what he's done. He's written the book An Island in Time, 50 Years of the Point Reyes National Seashore, commemorating the 50th anniversary. We have Paul Sadin from the Historical Research Associates in Seattle. And Paul, before becoming a consulting historian, spent 10 years at Mount Rainier as an interpretive ranger for that national park. Is currently doing other kinds of projects, including the history of the dam and the water systems on the Olympic Peninsula. I think doing some work on a Superfund site, pretty diverse kinds of work. He's the author of the administrative history known as Managing Land in Motion, the administrative history of the Point Reyes Seashore, published in 2007 by the National Park System. So a really definitive book written with and through the National Park Service. And then we have Laura Watt, a faculty and professor of environmental policy and regulation at Sonoma State. Did her seminal work at UC Berkeley on the history of land use of the Point Reyes National Seashore. And that is now quickly going to be coming forward as a book that's going to be released by UC Press, known as The Paradox of Preservation, Wildlands and Working Landscapes on the National Seashore. So 3 folks that I guarantee you they've delved into congressional records and interviews and photos and things deeper than any of us probably would ever want to. And we thank them for doing that work for us. So we're going to learn tonight. We're going to learn about this long history of how the seashore came to be. So with that, I'm going to ask John Hart to come up. We're going to sit and listen to him for a little bit, and as he finishes, we're going to have the 3 of them come over here and have a continued discussion on the topic of the concept of a seashore and when and how it came to be.
Thank you very much, David. When I was sitting down to try to brief the period leading to about 1960, spring of 1960, when the seashore as we know it really began to take shape and relate it to agriculture, I was almost thinking, what agriculture? Because in the minds of those planners in the early days, several generations of them, agriculture was the merest sideshow, perhaps even an impediment to the essentially recreational park that they had in mind. But looking into my notes and sources a little more deeply, I realized that the continuing debates and tensions about the state and future of agriculture in the seashore, in a way, go all the way back. From the beginning, you can see 3 different attitudes taking shape. toward farming on the peninsula and in the seashore. First, that it's an anachronism, an old thing to be gotten rid of as soon as possible. Second, that it is a pleasant thing to tolerate as long as economics and personal preference let it continue, which won't be too long. We'll be nice to the farmers, but eventually they will disappear. And the third is an active promotion of retaining farms in the seashore context. And you see all of them creeping into this historical record. I'll jump through a few key years. The first was 1929, at the end of a decade in which the national conversation began to turn to the loss of shoreline access, particularly on the East Coast. And in that year, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the son of the even more famous Senior, executed a study for the then very new State Parks Commission surveying the coastline of California. He identified 120 sites that might be worth acquisition. His description of Point Reyes in full is this: Point Reyes Peninsula Park, hilly, forested, mesa, canyon, beach and bluff lands fronting on Drake's Bay, Pacific Ocean and Tomales Bay, scenically fine, high recreational possibilities, embraces several subordinate projects. What David was just saying about the, quoting Dewey about the components of Point Reyes made me think of those subordinate projects. In 1935, under the New Deal, the concern about shoreline access continued to mount. Harold Ickes, FDR's Secretary of the Interior and an idealist and empire builder, was looking around, particularly the east coast of the United States, for big projects, of which he said, it doesn't matter what you call them. Call it a national park or a national seashore or a state park or anything you please. I say the people have a right to a fair share of it. And his prodding led to the production of a document called Study of a National Seashore Recreational Area, Point Reyes Peninsula, California, in 1935. This document proposed a national seashore very similar in outline to what we eventually got. It cited its undevelopment, its closeness to metropolitan centers, praised its natural values to the skies, but seemed to see it mainly as a place for, and I quote, surf bathing, swimming and diving, hunting, camping, climbing, and general exploration. The length of beach development can reach the extent of 7 miles along Drake's Bay, and as conditions demand, approximately 12 miles along the Great Beach. And of agriculture, he said, this, besides all these, are bold rolling hills, now pasture lands, giving an exhilarating sense of freedom and space. And he goes on to say that one of the obstacles to executing this dream would be the resistance of existing agricultural landowners, who obviously would not be expected to stay in business. So already we have one of the attitudes, which is farms really don't belong there, they don't matter, we'll get rid of them. In his defense, or their defense, the team's defense, it might be said that there was an awful lot of dairy land in Marin County in those days, and it didn't seem quite as an endangered species as it would later. In 1943, there was a document called the Master Recreation Plan at the county level, echoed by the state, calling for a park in the woodland from Tomales Point along Inverness Ridge to Bear Valley and a corridor to the sea. This concept would have skirted the farmlands, And this could be seen as a nod to the importance of agriculture. We're not going to take it, we're going to go around it. We're going to take the woods. In '54, the Marin Conservation League called for this implementation with the addition of a skinny shoreline fringe running around the esteros and around the whole coastline. Didn't go anywhere. But it did influence the next great study, which was dated June 30th, 1957, conducted by a Park Service man named George Collins, who in midstream found out about the existence of this 1935 study and was severely tempted, he says, to echo it and call for almost the whole peninsula to be in a park. But he decided that wasn't feasible, and taking his cue from these slightly earlier plans, he came up with a 28,000 acre outline, which omitted most of the more important ranches in the northern part of the seashore. This document was sat on for a year, rather strangely, although there were rumors. And this was also a period in which there were the first stirrings toward renewed development. There had always been boosters in West Marin who had dreams for huge cities all over Point Reyes. Many of them came to nothing, most of them. But after about 2 decades of depression and war in which the subject hadn't even been raised, there was a stirring of interest. And at the same time, due to a quirk of state tax laws, ranchers who were by no means land despoilers entered into, sold their timber rights to an Oregon lumberman, actually picked as relatively responsible, and logging began. So Collins later said that he wished he'd gone for the 1935 plan, that he felt he was too cautious in his version. But even that one proved to be very controversial and led to the formation a few weeks after its announcement of the West Marin Property Owners Association, which was an amalgam of ranchers who were really in the leading roles and some component of speculators who, for their different reasons, feared this new proposal. Why did the ranchers fear it, since they weren't mostly in it, at least the key ranches? They felt that there would be an incompatibility, that having people swarming on and around their borders would lead to pressure on their herds, would lead to trespass, vandalism, the usual things that can happen. So, and I think they also may have read the mind of George Collins a little bit, or just had a sense that the 28,000 acre proposal might be kind of the shoe in the door. And indeed, in the next several years, the plan exhibited a tendency to grow. And this is mostly behind the scenes. 28,000 acres is still the what's out there in front of the public. But there's correspondence going on in the background, and there are people's memoirs later that describe what the real thinking was. Collins feeling he really should have gone for 53,000 acres. Verna Dunshee, one of the leading local conservationists, talking about the possibility of buying the ranches and leasing them back. And some discussion of, several options are being kicked around behind the scenes. And during 1959, rumors are spreading, which are quite correct, about an expansion of the park plan. And on April 14th, 1960, at a hearing in Kentfield, which is the end of my segment, it's official. that the park is to include almost the entire peninsula, including the heart of the dairy lands and grazing lands, and how are we going to incorporate them? How are we going to manage it? What are we going to do about it? Now, I mentioned the three attitudes. So far, I only mentioned one by example in 35, when that first study really wanted the ranches out, plainly. Verna Dunshee, whom I mentioned, rather plainly wanted the ranches to remain, whether inside or outside the park. I think this was genuine. I think she was really, she really saw value in it. And I think that Carolyn Livermore also did, the grande dame of Marin County Conservation. And Collins himself was kind of in this middle position because he believed, he'd done some economic sleuthing and concluded that the economic value of the dairies was not very high. And he said, we don't, to himself, and in later remarks, later recalling it, we don't need to make any effort to get rid of them. They'll disappear by themselves. And this is kind of that middle position that continues to be voiced by influential people in West Marin today, as all three indeed are. I'll stop with that and pass the baton. And we'll talk.
Why don't you take a seat? So I'm going to ask that Paul and Laura and John take a seat. And this is the question period for this part of the concept of a seashore. And so I want to just ask the general question, what's important for us to understand about the concept of a seashore relative to, say, Yellowstone? It happened in 35, as John laid out. It happened around the country. So what is that? What is a seashore, and how is it different, or why is it different for the Park Service to manage and hold?
Well, John,
Oh, no, I was just going to say we get to figure out who gets to talk first.
Yes.
Please.
Well, I've been talking.
well, I think John pointed out that, how do you pronounce his name? Ickes?
Ickes.
Ickes, I think.
Thank you. He actually didn't see that much of a difference. He saw that Park Service, and prior to that, Congress, before there was a Park Service, had been setting aside these mountain parks or other places that were these unique landscapes. And he thought that seashores were equally unique and equally deserving of protection, but they had been neglected to that point.
And I'd add to this that in some ways similar, but in some ways very different. The earliest parks were all already owned lands, already federally owned lands that then Congress was setting aside and saying, we're not going to have homesteading here, we're not going to do other kinds of developments here, we're going to set them aside and make them into parks. So that's how you get Yosemite and Yellowstone and a lot of the early big parks. Starting in the 30s, but really ramping up in the late 50s and then through the 60s and 70s, you get this movement within the Park Service of wanting to bring parks to the people. There's a campaign called Mission 66 that starts in 1956, 10-year campaign to try and both improve development in existing parks and then also to provide more parks close to urban areas so that we're going to have parks not just far away that you get in your station wagon and drive with your family, but really close by. And so the seashores and lake shores, almost all of them, with the exception of Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, were part of that Parks for the People campaign, trying to create parks deliberately close to urban areas. And in order to do that, they needed to acquire private land. So that's in the way in which all of the seashores are very different than Yosemite and Yellowstone. They're acquired from people who have been living there in some cases for a long time, as opposed to empty federal land where the native tribes have been pushed out, but there haven't been Anglo settlers for the most part.
I had a sensation rekindled by reading your book, which I am a very privileged person. We got advance text. That the seashores at the same time were regarded as a little bit different when they were first thought about in the 30s, at least, that as Icky said, it doesn't matter what you call them as long as we preserve these blocks of coastal access. So it seemed like maybe he wasn't thinking of them as subject to all of the directives of the 1916 Organic Act. I was going to start my talk with the Organic Act, and then I thought, well, actually, they represented a new start. Is that?
That's right. I think that's right. There's a lot of conversation in the early hearings for here at Point Reyes and for many of the other seashores and lakeshores of congressmen sort of reassuring everybody, this isn't a national park. It's not the same degree of preservation or protection that we think of for the crown jewels. This is much more use-oriented in terms of recreation use, not timber cutting or huge industrial mining. But it is much more that idea that we want people to come. And in fact, there's a lot of conversation about how establishing the seashores will take some of the pressure off the real parks that are up in the mountains. So there's definitely that sort of sense of a different standard.
And it's also interesting that although there's all kinds of talk in these early reports about fish, about wildlife, about rare plants, it's all in there. It definitely plays second string to recreational development. It's mentioned, and it's just kind of taken on faith that you can protect all of the species and, for instance, dredge Limentura stero for a swimming hole at the same time.
Paul, might I ask you, you want to add, and that'd be great, but can you just give us 20 seconds on the Organic Act? It got mentioned just now, and maybe we all need to know what it is.
Okay, I'll think back. One thing to keep in mind is national parks existed long before the National Park Service. 1872 was Yellowstone, or you could consider Yosemite Valleys. The federal government setting that aside in 1865 as the first national park idea put into practice. So in 1916, after there were, 10, 12 parks by that point in time, the powers that be decided it was time to create a National Park Service, and the Organic Act is what spells out actually the inherent conflict that is imbued in the Park Service, which is to preserve and also provide for use and enjoyment of the public. So that is language that was in the acts that created, for instance, Yellowstone, Crater Lake, Mount Rainier, that preserve and also provide for public use. And that is also included in the Organic Act that actually Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was one of the authors of. And in fact, that's why we this year are celebrating the National Park Service. It's not that the national parks, they go back much farther than that, but that's the beginning of the Park Service in terms of having an organizing agency that's going to oversee what's happening in the parks. And a really interesting part about that is that we don't think about as much today is that it was a small fledgling agency at that time. The National Forest Service, established in 1907, was a much bigger agency with a very powerful head, Gifford Pinchot. And one of the first things Stephen Mather, the first director of the Park Service, did was to keep in mind how he could grow his agency. And up till this time that we're going to be talking about here, a lot of those changes that had to do with promoting use in the parks has to do with promoting national parks as something the public would support and that Congress would continue to support.
So let me pose one other question, and then we can move on to the next era. But remembering that we're right up to 1959, 1960, what are other signs and voices of opposition to the concept? That, I think, John, you said that plan was kept under wraps for a year. So can we just get a little more detail about, what were the concerns? What were some of the opposition?
Well, my reading of it is that there were two strands of concern that the park proponents tended to meld into one. There were the boosters, the would-be developers, who did have fantasies of major development at Point Reyes. And then there were the ranchers who mainly just wanted to be left alone. Although, in fairness, it has to be said that ranchers also don't like to have all possibility of speculative sale removed because it might come in handy. That's not completely absent from consciousness. Yet, basically, they were asking to be left alone and not disturbed, even though they were allied with the real estate types who were saying, in 50 years, this is going to look like Burlingame. Get used to it and get out of our way.
I think the Marin County Board of Commissioners was also an initial opponent, a very strong opponent of the plan.
4-1.
And, what's that?
4-1.
Oh, yeah. And one of the things that county commissioners think about is their tax rolls. And once you put government, the same thing happens when military bases are created in areas where there hadn't been previously. That's a lot of land coming off the tax rolls that is not going to be producing tax anymore. So that's another issue that comes up with that.
Well, and just to piggyback on that, one more piece is that, I think something was fairly well known to a lot of people in this audience, that dairy in particular, but all agriculture needs kind of a critical mass in order for it to work, right? That you need enough operators to keep the feed store open, and you need enough operators to make it economical to truck the milk across the hill to the creamery and that sort of thing. And so there was a real concern, I think, in the local community as well as in the Board of Supervisors and other folks, that if the sort of larger version of the park, the 53,000 acre park that would take potentially all of the ranches, the then operating ranches in the park, at which time there were 25 still operating in one way or another, 15 dairies and 10 beef ranches, if I'm remembering it right. If you take all those out of the economy, there was this concern that the whole agricultural economy would collapse because there wouldn't be enough of that critical mass to keep it going. So I think that's a very pragmatic concern in addition to the tax issue about just the economic health of the county and so forth.
Good. Paul, please.
I just wanted to add one other thing that lends some perspective to the whole idea of national seashores. And I'm not sure if folks who've grown up in California or anywhere on the West Coast have the same perspective. So I'm not a local. The one personal thing I can add to this is having grown up in Connecticut, the times when my family started taking me to the beach, and when I started going with friends after we got our driver's license, there were 260 miles of Connecticut coastline. There were, in little bits and pieces, 7 miles of public land, 7 miles of sand, and that included places that were like the waterfronts of places like Bridgeport and New Haven where you would not want to go in the water. So very few public places, and I don't mean just public access. I mean so the state beaches we used to go to, the restrictions would seem incredible, I think, to you now. It is a sandy beach, but you don't see sand. You only see blankets. The entire beach is taken up with blankets. If you want to go for a walk, you can't. Public access is also restricted down to the low water line. Every private homeowner has a fence 6 feet tall, wooden fence going down below the low water line. So the idea that for Easterners, this idea that beaches are disappearing is very, very real. It's a very real threat in places like New York State, in Connecticut, in Rhode Island. Just my personal piece of context.
Very good. That's,
Yeah.
lest we think this is just an empire-building fantasy.
Yeah, no, very, very different context in the East Coast, and similarly a different context real quickly in Los Angeles, that there is, sort of Malibu is starting to happen in the late 50s. And so this idea that, what we've already seen with private interests gobbling up the beach on the East Coast could conceivably happen here. Of course, Malibu and Point Reyes are a little bit different in terms of their climatic conditions, but there's sort of this idea that, oh my gosh, development is coming and it's almost inevitable. It's just this inexorable force, and therefore we've got to get ready.
So great. Let's transition to the next period, and that's going to be Paul leading us on the defining. And as we make that transition, I'm going to ask Betty Nunez, rancher on Point Reyes National Seashore.
So are we going to try this with the lights down? What did we decide? I think that'll work. Actually, I want to thank David and Sally for inviting me. It's a great way to get re-involved in what's been happening at Point Reyes. I finished the bulk of the research for this about 10 years ago, so if I'm a little struggling with a couple of the details, that would be why. But I continue to be involved with National Park Service issues, particularly around founding legislation. So I'm going to cover 1960 to about 1970. An awful lot happens during that time, so mostly I'm just going to give an overview, and maybe folks can ask specific questions afterwards just to highlight specifics. So Point Reyes, the peninsula, is an incredibly unique place. Point Reyes National Seashore is a unique place. The geology, biology, the cultural history, but also the history of human interactions that have gone on there over time, and particularly over the course of the last 100 years or so. But I want to emphasize that the idea of Point Reyes National Seashore is not unique. And this is a little bit my perspective, but it's my reading of the legislative history and also what came before it, that Point Reyes was one of a series of national seashores, and that this was part of the agenda of the National Park Service and also of Congress and the executive branch. So as John talked about, the first time that the idea of, at least to the public, this 53,000 acre Point Reyes National Seashore with a configuration similar to what we have today came up in 1960. And then that was put forward by Clem Miller and Claire Engel in their second proposal for a Point Reyes National Seashore. And a lot happened during those next 2 years. And the reasons for that are many. When Engel and Miller put forward their first seashore bill in 1959, it was not the only one. There were several other seashore bills, individual seashore bills, but also combined ones. For instance, Senate Bill 2010 suggested 5 to 7 different national seashores. At that time, there was also something in the mid-1980s that had been created called the Outdoor Recreation Resources Review Committee that was part of the effort to create much more recreation space in the United States for the booming population, a booming economy, and also, I mean, it's kind of sad to read this stuff now, but also talking about all the leisure time we were going to have as time went forward in America. When President Kennedy came to office, he also had this as part of his idea. In one of his first messages to Congress in February 1961, he said he has a new conservation agenda, and it has a two-pronged approach. One piece that is going to involve Point Reyes down the road is a nationwide wilderness protection system. The other piece is national seashores, and in that speech he points out to Cape Cod, Padre Island, and Point Reyes National Seashores. And those are the three that will be created in the next 2 years. In fact, his Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall, talked about them even strategizing about the order those bills would move forward. That Cape Cod would come first. It already had more support. And of course, Kennedy was from Massachusetts. He'd already proposed on a Cape Cod bill. So you see this united effort, and also this idea that these were things that came, it was part of a national push. At the local level, there was much less enthusiasm for this, but there were some things going on, such as the beginnings of development. Drake's Bay Estates was one of the proposed subdevelopments that was going to take place. And I think Laura points out in her book that it's questionable, how much this would have driven, if I've got it right, really, how much this really would make a difference. But I think it makes a difference in people's minds. I remember interviewing Harold Gilliam, the author of Island in Time, and him talking about sitting there in his home in San Francisco and watching the hills across the bay getting leveled, them cutting the tops off of them. And I think in people's minds, development maybe was a bigger threat than than it actually was, but that still has a lot to do with, for instance, the local media in San Francisco supporting Point Reyes National Seashore. So one of the things we look at to try and find out why did a park or seashore or lakeshore come into being is the legislative history. Legislative histories are never exacting in terms of what they give us. There's always ambiguity, and that's because there's many parties involved. And for a legislative history, you usually look at what did the authors of the bill intend, what did Congress intend, what did the agency, in this case the Park Service, intend, and what did the president intend. And I already talked a little bit about what President Kennedy had in mind. Claire Engel and Clem Miller talked about both recreation, but also a desire to save a very special place. Miller talked about the term breathing space. He had a summer home in Inverness. He loved the beaches, and that idea of just having wide open space at the seashore was an important concept to him. George Collins, who John mentioned and is pictured here along with his daughter. I forget which one Collins is, though. His focus was on recreation, and recreation in the 1960s meant not only hiking, not only bird watching, but also boating, surfing, and maybe golf courses. So after the bill is put forward, we get both, it goes to the House and then it goes to the Senate. And so I just want to look at what were the things that if you look at the final reports that came out of the House committee, that came out first to the Senate and then to the House. The things that came out of the Senate report in favor of Point Reyes National Seashore, these are just some of the specific things that they're looking at. And to summarize, Point Reyes possessed rare scenery, diverse recreation opportunities, scenic scientific recreation values, easy reach of a metropolitan area, that was very important, and also a particular focus on water-related recreation, which the committee thought was an important thing to be paying attention to at the time. Out of that committee report also comes the new language that creates the pastoral zone. The pastoral zone came about for several reasons, but one of them was that the Park Service's initial idea of creating this 53,000-acre park that would be done through land purchases wasn't financially possible. And Miller talks about in his own papers, we either had to reduce the acreage or we had to do something else that would reduce the price. So creating the pastoral zone was one way to reduce the price, and as the House pointed out here, also tried to help protect the owners of the ranches for as long as possible. And I think it's important to see that I think I've jumped ahead a couple slides. So we're at the House report, which is very similar. I think as you move from the Senate report to the House report and what those committees did, as time goes on, there's more recognition of the importance of agriculture, both for the idea of preserving personal property rights, for the idea of preserving a way of life that these ranchers had, and also, as you see in the bottom statement there, a way to, a recognition that the ranches have actually created the landscape people know as Point Reyes. So 54 years ago today, John Kennedy signed the Point Reyes National Seashore Act. One of the last changes in the legislation was the statement that no parcel of more than 500 acres within the pastoral zone will be acquired without the consent of the owners for as long as it remains in its natural state. And another part of the language is that it doesn't interrupt the recreation purposes of the seashore. So that's going to be the law as it stands until 1970. Once the seashore comes into being, actually before any land is set aside, the idea of a national seashore is already in people's minds, and the attendance starts to go up dramatically. And some of the earliest uses were the things that some of the designers of the plan had in mind. Things like sunbathing, nature walks, surfing. And I love that the surfer dude, has the NPS Arrowhead emblem on his short shorts there. This period of time is also really important because of what goes on between 1962 and 1970. The National Wilderness Act is created in 1964, the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966, the National Environmental Protection Act in 1969-70. Although these are going to shape Point Reyes through the future. On the ground at Point Reyes during this time, smaller scale things are going on. Farming's continuing, and the beginning of administration is put in place. One of the first land purchases was Bear Valley Ranch, and that's where the initial headquarters went. During this time is also a period when the Park Service is very interested in development. It had just finished in 1966. It completes its Mission 66 project, one of the biggest federal spending projects at that time on public resources. They also have this master planning process that tends to think development. So even though Point Reyes was set aside to preserve it with the idea that preserve it from developers creating private property there, actually one of the new threats became the Park Service. So I don't know if you can see the slides at the right are from that original master plan. And one of the big parts of that plan was to create, I'm not sure you can tell, 4-lane road going down to Limatour, where that nice narrow road is now, and to dredge Limatour Estro and put a dam there so that you could create a warm water swimming area. There would be a marina there. And one of the interesting things here is that some of you might know the Park Service has long been criticized for not using science effectively in its first, let's say, 3/4 of its history. One of the reasons this didn't happen is they requested a study from the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, which had started not long after that, and they pointed out the value of Drake's Estro for the avian species there. And it had an impact with the early superintendents in stalling this until it got to be time enough where that was no longer going to be viable. But not long after that, the director of the National Park Service, George Hartzog, came up with a plan to to obtain and then sell 92,000 acres of the National Seashore to private developers as a way to raise more money for the seashore. And though he said the plan would be non-intrusive, when a couple folks, Katie Miller, for instance, Clem Miller's widow, and Bill Duddleson, Clem Miller's chief of staff of his head staffer, saw the plans, they were outraged, and that was the start of a new campaign, basically to recreate Point Reyes National Seashore. So it went through a second creation project, the Save Our Seashore campaign, that was oriented towards setting aside the seashore so it wouldn't be developed in the way the Park Service was now thinking about it. And I think, the original Point Reyes bill, original Point Reyes National Seashore is not like, for instance, the Golden Gate story, where there's really a strong citizen effort to pull things together and make that happen. But the Save Our Seashore campaign was much more of a unified approach between people in Congress, leaders in the Bay Area, the Marin County commissioners got on board, and also ranchers were in favor of it. Most of them. I don't know the statistical number of how many were in favor of not. But this led to the 1970 changes in the law that did several things. It added the amount of money to obtain land in the seashore up to $56 million to obtain all that land. And for our ranching story, very importantly, it takes Section 4 out of it. And Section 4 is the one that guaranteed ranchers would be able to keep their property. And I think I'd be best talking about this in terms of questions about why this came about, and takes a longer explanation to say why even some ranchers supported that. But it enabled the Park Service to start buying up the ranches in the pastoral zone and begin the reservations of reservation and use. One other piece, this amendment called the Ryan Amendment that I've highlighted there, specifically put in there so that the Park Service cannot try and do the kind of purchase and then sell pieces of the seashore. And I think, it's another thing that's not unique is the idea of conflicts in national parks. Conflicts over ranching, in fact, go back to Yosemite Valley not long after it was set aside. And a great irony, John Muir, first experience in Yosemite Valley was as a sheep herder. So the conflicts continue, they expand over time. That's all I've got.
You are. We've got one more iteration, but we're doing great.
Next, we'll sit in a different order, and
Yeah.
you'll get confused as to who's who.
So I want to pick up and kind of where we left off a little bit and ask, in 1962 and then again in 1970, how did those two enabling legislations and the discussions leading up to them and overcome the opposition that we talked about that was there in 1959 and 1960?
Well, actually, in Congress, there was not a lot of opposition to the 1962 Act. The main opposition, there were two ideas that were mainly concerning to folks in Congress. One of them was that this idea of starting this model that Cape Cod had started and Point Reyes would be continuing, of basically not using the old Park Service idea of buying land that was already federal land or using federal land, but of buying private land. One of the other big concerns in the debates for the 1962 legislation was that Congress folks were foreseeing that ranchers would want to sell, and one of their main concerns was that federal money would not be available right away to buy the ranches if the ranchers wanted to sell.
I think also it's one of the things that I find really interesting. A lot of my work on this period of time I've gotten from reading the hearings that were held both here in Marin County and then back in DC. The reports that you end up seeing are kind of big summaries of all that's been discussed, and obviously the legislation is sort of an uber summary in some ways. The hearings are fascinating because they are recorded verbatim, and so you get all these funny little jokes and people throwing insults at each other politely because it's Congress, and there's all this sort of back and forth. And what I found really fascinating in reading those is how much the Park Service is sort of saying, well, here's our idea, and we'd like to create this seashore, and we're going to work out the details about how to acquire, whether to acquire, et cetera. And Congress is really listening to the locals. They're really saying, hey, how is this going to affect the people who live there? How is this going to affect the local economy? And trying to rein the Park Service back in the hearings coming up to 62. And I think you see the same thing repeating in the late 60s when, as you said, Director Hartzog is like, hey, here's a great idea. We've run out of money, so let's sell one of the pieces we've already bought to a developer who will build something like 14,000 homes. I can't remember how many. Quite a number. Would have looked more like Walnut Creek. And then we'll use the money that we get from that developer to buy the rest of the land that we haven't bought yet, but we've run out of money for. So there was sort of this back and forth. And again, Congress really kind of comes to the locals' rescue in a way. They say, we're really not interested in that, Director Hartzog. We don't think that's appropriate for the Park Service to buy land from private individuals and then sell it to create a subdivision. So I think it's not so much that there's opposition one way or another, but there's this interesting kind of play back and forth about the idea of how to get this seashore created sort of on the cheap, and then how are we going to make sure that we do that without harming the local interests.
You tell the great story, Laura, that had somehow escaped me of Hort Hartzog, the Park Service director, coming to the Board of Supervisors and saying, please, please impose agricultural zoning, partly because of our own missteps. He didn't say that. Land prices are spiraling, tax burdens are growing, the ranchers are getting into crisis. We have to have ag zoning, and the supervisors said, no, we can't do that. We fear it would be a taking. We don't dare. It was 6 or 7 years before they got around to doing it. But meanwhile, the Point Reyes issue had to be dealt with and was.
There was, the main opposition to the 1970 amendment actually came from President Nixon and also the Bureau of the Budget. They really balked at spending that kind of money. And it was only when Nixon decided it was to his political advantage to get behind the bill that that could happen.
I'm just stuck with this, why did it take 10 years to get from where we had a plan that maybe was or wasn't revealed to signing in 62 and then the amendment in 70?
Yeah, I think money is the main answer. There's a wonderful quote from Clem Miller's widow, Katie Miller, later Johnson, sort of saying that 14 million just seemed like the right price tag for a seashore. I don't know where that number came from, but she said that, people seemed to think that was an acceptable amount. We knew it was too little from the get-go, but the idea was to get it established, get it started, and then go back and ask for more money later, kind of the way teenagers get money out of their parents. And so, I think that was very deliberate and very, very well understood by those who were undertaking it. The idea of the pastoral zone staying as a private zone of, completely privately owned land came from Everglades. They had done what was called the hole in the donut style there, where they had a hole of private land surrounded by public land that was being acquired to create the park there. The problem was that there were a lot of, and it is a more complicated story, I think, than we have time for this evening, but there were a lot of missteps in terms of implementing that. The first piece of land that was bought by the Park Service was not in the public use zone, it was in the pastoral zone, because they had a willing seller and they said, great, somebody wants to sell to us in this area we're not really supposed to buy in, but we really want to, so great, we'll buy it. And they bought for markedly higher prices than most people had expected at the time. So there's a lot of really fascinating data about sort of this process by which all of the land values got pushed up much faster than anyone expected. Like you said, that puts incredible financial burdens on the people who still own the land, because now at this point we didn't have agricultural values to taxation. Both property taxes and, more importantly, estate taxes were on highest and best value. So if your ranch was worth $250 an acre as a ranch, but if you could sell it as a subdivision for $1,000 an acre, you're being taxed at $1,000 an acre. And that changed, the price of milk didn't change that much between 1960 and 1970. But I think the taxes, I can't remember which ranch it is, but I had data, one of them, in 1960, their property taxes were about $1,200 a year, and by 1970, they're about $22,000 a year. So it's a huge change. That really changes people's willingness to be purchased. And it was through an agreement, a very specific agreement, that, again, Congress didn't want to impose this condemnation authority, essentially giving the Park Service the ability to compel people to sell their private land. Didn't want to impose that on the ranchers without their agreement. And it was only once the sort of group of the ranchers, the Property Owners Association, got together at Boyd Stewart's ranch in 1970 in the early part of the year and had a discussion and said, gee, we're facing all these financial struggles, and we're concerned that if we don't give them, allow this condemnation authority to be given to the Park Service is going to sell it as a development. And there's a very eloquent quote from Boyd Stewart saying, we would rather stay here and ranch forever, but if the choice is between a subdivision and a park, we'll take a park.
Stewart also relayed the feeling of some ranchers who had been acquired by the Park Service that they had been treated well and that their worst
Good
fears
point.
had not been realized. So there was a period of rather good relations going on.
So there is a third amendment, or second amendment, a third moment that the legislation, and I know, Laura, you're going to help us get inside that, but before we leave it, I want to make sure you kind of help us really understand what, Paul, you shared. Originally, there was Section 4, and then there wasn't, and that was for strategic reasons. Can you, the three of you, just expand on that, and then we will get to the 1978 amendment here in a minute.
Well, I can give the Park Service explanation. The Section 4 enabled the Park Service to go ahead and purchase land in the pastoral zone if that land was being sold for something else or it wasn't being used for the quote ranching or dairying purposes. In other words, if one of the ranchers wanted to subdivide and then they went ahead and did that, or they put up an amusement park there, the Park Service had the right then to go in with condemnation and buy it. What the Park Service realized, though, is that if they waited, because property values are going up, if they waited till that point, the property for them to purchase it, not only would changes have already taken place, but it would cost 3-4 times as much money, which they just did not have an endless budget for this kind of thing.
Good. Let's make the transition, and Laura will lead us in this last part, the implementation.
Okay, I'm going to apologize a little bit in advance. My mom and I just returned from a 2.5-week-long research trip. Today, we started at South Lake Tahoe this morning and got snowed on coming over Carson Pass, and I did not have time to print out my talk, so I need to look at it on my little computer screen. And I've also, just as a completely shameless shill here, I brought some flyers for my book that'll be out in November. It's a 30% discount, yay! You can get it for less than $20 if you use the, so I gave these to David. I think they'll be out on the table outside after the show. Put that on the floor. Okay, so we all know that today is the 54th anniversary of Point Reyes. That's kind of exciting. And thank you very much to David and Sally for organizing this, and to John and Paul for setting the stage for this last bit. I've just threw in, I believe in photographs. This is the way I work. And so we all know the sign here. I put in, forgot that's not on my screen. It's on this thing. Aha. Arrow. There we go. Just threw in a couple of images that will echo some of what we've already talked about. This is the original ownership map made by the Park Service in 1960 that does show that there were a total of 62 owners when they first started thinking about the seashore. That number changed by the time they actually implemented it in 1962. But I think you can also see that the bulk of the land is owned by the big 25 ranches that were still in operation at that time. So that's just kind of a fun historical document. And this, we've already talked about how this original intention was really the main thrust was to provide recreation access to the California coastline, like North Beach here in this picture, while also then keeping the ranches private. And here's the sort of first incarnation of the possible ranching area shown in white and the public use zone shown in green. The ranching area ended up expanding because it was pointed out to them, gee, you just took out 4 or 5 of the largest dairies on the peninsula. So these got put back in. But I think this also gives a little bit of a better picture in sort of concert with what Paul had earlier of, some of these pretty, there's a whole new road here going down the middle of the seashore. They're moving Sir Francis Drake over and putting it alongside the Estero. And there's all these big developments of exciting swimming and diving and sunbathing and all these things that, of course, we're all going to do in 40-degree water. That's a great idea. Okay. Going forward, in 1970, John Sansing became the superintendent of Point Reyes after they had had a series of several other sort of shorter term superintendents. He was an accountant by training and was generally considered to be supportive of the ranchers in the seashore, although he was known to be a bit brusque at times, not always the easiest personality, and he did sometimes play favorites. So there, he's sort of not the easiest guy to get along with necessarily. In 71 and 72, after that second sort of piece of legislation was passed in 1970, you get most of the ranches that had not been previously acquired by the Park Service were then purchased with this new additional funding that Congress had provided. Almost all of them kept 20-year reservations of use and occupancy, which is actually a discount off of the purchase price. If you get a reservation of use and occupancy, you essentially are buying the ability to remain on the land as if you still owned it for a set number of years. And for that set number of years, you take off 1% of the purchase price per year. So most of the ranches, ironically, Keogh's had 30, so this is the one exception. But most of the other ranches had 20-year reservations of use and occupancy, which meant 20% discount off of the purchase price. Some of them, of course, remained dairies. There were some already raising beef cattle. I think these are the Stewart's cattle in an area you actually can't see anymore because the willows have grown up. But there were also some conversions from dairy to beef during this time. The 1970s, of course, is also the first big explosion of the environmental era. There's a lot of new environmental legislation, water quality concerns. The National Environmental Policy Act was passed, all these different pieces of legislation that were making things a little more difficult, a little more expensive to stay in dairy in particular. And so there was a lot of sort of changes going on within the industry as well. Let's see. Under reservations of use and occupancy, the ranchers don't own the land and they don't own the buildings. They've sold that to the federal government. They do own their own cattle and their own equipment. They're also responsible for what's called cyclical maintenance, which is essentially day-to-day repairs. So, as an ordinary tenant, if I'm renting an apartment and it needs painting, I call the landlord, and the landlord arranges for a painter to come and pays for it and does all that stuff. Not so much with the ranches here in the seashore. They're responsible for that kind of day-to-day maintenance. They also have to carry insurance on the buildings to help pay for repairs if and when they're needed. And any changes of work that might be done, if you're going to paint the barn or you're going to provide housing for your employees, all has to be improved by the Park Service. So they're kind of acting as owners while they still have reservations of use and occupancy, but in a lot of ways they're not. They're still having to answer to the Park Service itself. So what happens as we're implementing, then all this, the entire seashore ends up being purchased. Some of the ranches stay in operation. Some buildings get used adaptively. So these are the old bunkhouses at W Ranch. They become the park, or Bear Valley Ranch, depending on how you want to call it. They become park headquarters, as we're all fairly familiar with. Other buildings don't get used adaptively and sit, which is not usually a good thing for a building. The Randall House down in the Alima Valley at one time was considered to be, they were thinking about moving it from where it exists now along Highway 1 to Bear Valley to make it into the visitor center. It didn't happen. There was a lot of back and forth thing. Sansing wanted to tear it down. Local historic preservation folks did not want that. It has been sitting empty and boarded up since it was purchased in 1974 and is now a bat habitat, which is a little strange. It was mentioned, so a lot of, sort of changes happening with buildings. Some are getting used, some are not, some are being torn down, et cetera. Also in the 70s, it was mentioned that the national level Wilderness Act was passed in 1964. The Park Service is ordered by Congress, along with the other agencies, to survey their holdings for lands that might qualify. And I just put some of the definition under the Wilderness Act of what a wilderness is on this slide. It's probably too much for you to read. But this is so Park Service here says, hey, okay, we'll go look for possible wilderness. And the first thing they found was this chunk, which was about 5,000 acres, or I think it may have even been smaller than that. And they said, look, 5,000 acres, that's great. And Congress and a lot of local Congress people, a lot of environmental groups kind of said, yeah, that's not enough. We'd like you to go look again. And so they went back and they looked in some more, and they said, hey, look, we found some more wilderness. Now we got about 10,000 acres. And they said again, yeah, we don't really like that size. We think you should find more. Would you look under the bed, please? And so this is a map from 1974. This period, the first recommendation was 71, and then they come up with this larger recommendation in 74. This is what was called the optimum unit. It's not on this piece of paper, but all the pieces that are in any kind of color, except for the ones that are private land, were considered as possible units in this wilderness designation, and this is more or less what we ended up with in 1976, a little bit over 25,000 acres designated as wilderness. Again, I've been spending a lot of time reading the hearings, the things that people were talking about as we're talking, trying to come up with this legislation. And in fact, a lot of the main local concerns about establishing wilderness was to try and limit vehicular access. There was actually one point where someone was suggesting close the entire seashore to cars, make them all park outside. And then also this idea of limiting development for recreation. Again, that map that you saw earlier with all of those deep sea fishing ports and other kinds of, golf coursey kinds of recreation. Locals really did not want the Park Service to put in that kind of pavement-oriented development, if you will, for recreation. And so that really, I think, was the main focus of wilderness designation and support for it here locally. So you end up with Drake's Beach as we know it now. It's not inside wilderness, but it has stayed fairly simple and relatively undeveloped, except for the gigantic parking lot, instead of having fancy restaurants and ocean cruises and all that kinds of stuff. So that's also going on in the 70s as we're trying to implement. I mentioned Sansing. He was not a big fan of historic preservation. He was much better at knocking things down. And honestly, by the sort of the general public, most ranches were not considered, quote, historic in the 1970s. It was sort of like, well, yeah, they're ranches. We think the lighthouse is historic. It's important. It's different than anything else. Ranches, there's lots of ranches, so why are they important? That has now changed. An exception was the Pierce Ranch, talked about early on as sort of an exemplar of let's have the public come and look at ranching. It also was then included within the wilderness boundary and was proposed as a location for a transplanted, hey, I'm pushing the wrong button again. 2 computers is too much. Transplanted Tule elk herd, which were brought in 1978. The McDonald family had been tenants on the ranch for quite some time. They had to relocate. And after some difficulties, this initial herd up on Tomales Point expanded pretty rapidly. Pierce then got sort of reimagined, whoops, too far forward. Thank you. Trying to go back. Got reimagined as a historic tour with some interpretive panels and so on. I'll try and speed up here. Also added the historic ranch signs in the late 1980s. This was sort of an attempt to give some explanation to why ranches were there. So these brown signs were added. They're added kind of haphazardly. There's a lot of historic ranches that don't have signs and some operating ranches that don't have signs, and so it's a little confusing, but anyway, there they are. David mentioned in 1978, Congress passed sort of a third piece of legislation that's really important for the ranches. They passed language, which was attached to a big omnibus parks bill, passed language allowing the shift from reservations of use and occupancy, which almost all the ranchers had, to special use permits or leases. So saying, we know these things are going to expire, they're almost all 20 years old, or they're 20 years in length. Once they do, existing previous owners or tenants will be given the first right of refusal to a permit or lease to remain in operation. So I think that's a really important piece. Congress recognizing and providing a mechanism for ranching to continue on into the future beyond that 20-year window. Real quickly, I'm not sure if this will show very well. This is a map taken from the book that's coming out, trying to map out what changes have occurred on the landscape with the ranches. Some ranches have gone out of operation voluntarily. Others have had a little more encouragement to go out of business over the time. Lots of stories that could be told there, but this gives at least a sense. Some of the ones that, there's some that are still being grazed for ranching, like F and E, but are not an operating ranch in its entirety in the same way that, say, A, B, and C are. This has a few more that are marked on here, like D Ranch, that went out since 1995, so more recent change. Other things that happened in this period of time as ranches are moving from reservations of use and occupancy to either leases or special use permits, they also were given some new rangeland management requirements in the 1990s, including being required to keep a minimum amount of residual dry matter on the landscape, on their pastures. And the language of the permits was standardized after 1995. Former leases shifted over to being special use permits. The latter, special use permits, are a source of revenue for the seashore directly, whereas leases, the money that comes in from a lease goes back to the general treasury, doesn't stay at the seashore. So there's a shift happening there as well. As in 1995, we got a new superintendent, Don Neubacher, who was here through 2009. And in the late 90s, he brought in a lot of changes. He had a much more of an emphasis on natural resources. He also had a real strong planning background. There were 2 permits, one in the seashore, one in the Olema Valley, that were canceled in the late 90s for a different variety of circumstances. Lots of stories there. Interestingly, as the reservations of use and occupancy shifted over to special use permits or leases, there was no environmental review. And to someone who studies environmental planning like myself, this actually makes some sense because they're a continuation of an existing use. No real change in what's going on in the land, so no real need to change, to do an examination of environmental impacts from that. In contrast, when ranches were taken out, there was also no environmental review, even though this is, in some cases, a very large change in land use. So that's just sort of an FYI. Things that have then happened since then, we've had the new populations of elk first released near Lemantour, and then a secondary population that showed up on the former Horick Ranch. They've been establishing themselves and have been spreading onto neighboring ranches. I did not take this photograph, but I sure wish I did. I just love that one. They are they sometimes get along when it's nap time, but other times they're competing for forage or jumping fences and causing trouble. And this is really, I think, an ongoing management challenge that I think the new ranch management plan is attempting to address. And I think, just to wrap things up here, with all of these changes and with the ongoing challenges, this working landscape really is a key part of what the seashore really is. It's not here by accident, as our title suggests. It's a part of what this park has always been ever since its founding days. In 1998, the remaining ranches in the seashore were found to be eligible to be listed as a historic district under the National Register of Historic Places. And that means that they were formally recognized now, as opposed to how they were seen in the 70s. They're formally recognized as a historic or cultural resource that falls under the Park Service's protection in the same way that endangered species or wilderness do. Then just wrapping up, in 2012, we had Secretary Salazar's pronouncement saying, not only do we want to support the ranches, we want to give them longer-term leases. The shorter-term leases that they've been on for a number of years simply aren't really adequate. And that's what has triggered the new ranch comprehensive management planning process that the park has sort of started in. And so that's really asking sort of, how are we going to look at the management issues going forward? And I thought I'd just leave the cattle up on the screen while we have more discussion. How do I do that? Off.
Let's go ahead and bring John and Paul up.
Give you that.
So let's go ahead and bring John and Paul and Laura on up.
I should have changed my name to Ringo, and then we could have.
And this is the last time. They'll be up here for your pleasure here shortly. So I just have a couple questions real quick, and then we will open it up. I would love to hear Paul and John, your interpretation of the importance of the 1978 amendment in terms of both its benefit to agriculture, its recognition of agriculture continuing, but also the designation of the wilderness areas. And what does that mean for the seashore going forward?
Well, I've seen, I use a kind of mental model of a triangle of values or uses which are seen to be in tension. The call it the wilderness aspect, including the biota, the agricultural aspect, and the recreational aspect. As we've seen, the recreational aspect, at least in terms of mass auto-oriented recreation, got pretty much suppressed in the early going. But the two other points of the triangle were each of them reinforced in this 1976-78 period. And at the same time, the seashore, which had been classified as a recreational area in a tripartite classification the Park Service had up to that time, was reclassified as a natural area like any other. So in a sense, the tension was all moved onto this axis between ag on the one hand and wilderness on the other, and each got a nod. The wilderness designations certainly locked in that aspect, and at the same time there was a committee report which now I've encountered some new information or disagreement about what exactly it meant, but I had understood it to say that in general agriculture in the seashore was to remain in perpetuity, and the Park Service was urged to move in this direction. Ralph Mayen, I think it was, advises that this might not actually have applied to the whole seashore, but that's technicality. In any case, there was, there was a yay for both teams, so to speak, right then.
Get out the pom-poms.
The idea that the biota and agriculture are incompatible or in competition is not necessarily true. That's another argument, but it's popularly perceived that way.
Paul, was there anything you wanted to add?
Well, environmental historians don't think of wilderness necessarily as a concrete thing. It's a concept. And I guess for me, some of the ideas that swirled around this is what interested me the most. Laura talked about the initial Park Service proposal was 5,000 acres. And in fact, almost all the national parks and national park areas were recalcitrant in in creating wilderness. And the main issue is, like any federal agency, they wanted to maintain control over their land. So almost all of the parks, seashores, National Historic sites stalled with creating wilderness areas. And that probably explains why initially there was, a smaller piece. I think the fact that it grew, Laura can talk to this much more extensively than I can, but one of the factors is it just shows what the environmental movement had done. The kind of group of folks, whether they're in Marin County or in San Francisco or nationwide, that have an investment that happens at these places. And, something that's sort of aside the point from this, but a key moment for Sansing when he came was the San Francisco oil spill in 1971, and the fact that it was glopping up oil on Point Reyes beaches. He was stunned, the number of people that showed up to help with that cleanup, and it really, it told him.
And a little irritated, wasn't he?
Yes, but I think to him it indicated you have to pay attention to what the public's saying too. We have to pay attention to what these environmentalists are saying too. Even though he very much promoted relationships with the ranchers, he was going to start listening to, as was the Park Service, going to have to start listening to the community more, whether that community was local or the broader national community.
My other question is just to ask you all to help us understand how the transition from reservations of use to special use permits and the historic designation, how did that change, go into more detail about how that changed management on the pastoral lands, on the ranches, maybe for the buildings and for the ranchers and their operations?
I feel utterly inadequate to explain this when there's a number of people who have been living with this day in and day out in the room. So maybe we could have some of that be part of the audience discussion as well. Certainly one of the big changes is with a reservation of use and occupancy, you know the time frame. It's very clear. It's part of the deed. There's no question. Nobody can take that back from you because it was part of the purchase agreement. So it's not something that can be tinkered with. It's this very set agreement. Leases, the original leases had fairly strong languages in them. They often included, they would have a 5-year term, but they would have a renewal clause up to, I believe, 4 renewals in some cases, so making it a 20-year lease, even though it was in 5-year increments. They had, I was told by one of the former park employees here that they use the term lease to sort of create a sense of permanence or a sense of security that maybe reached a little beyond the actual language of the document. If you actually look then at the documents called leases and the documents called special use permits, the legalese in them is almost identical. And it turns out that even when they have set terms like a 5-year or a 10-year or a 20-year, there's a lot of ways in which the Park Service unilaterally can change the terms of that lease, can impose new restrictions, or in fact can decide to simply not renew the lease at all, or permit, whichever word you use. So I think that's one of the biggest changes, is as the ranches move off of the reservations, they move into far more uncertainty. And in fact, they see some examples of some ranches being closed through the Park Service's own sort of discretionary decisions. And so that creates a sort of seed of, well, am I next? How do I manage this landlord? How do I keep from making them angry? How do I get the buildings maintained? The Park Service has more money than most of us do, but it still has an incredible long laundry list of things it needs to spend money on, and often that money comes with specific strings attached, in essence. So there may be trends in funding. This year, we want to focus on endangered species and things that will help endangered species. So projects that have an endangered species angle will get funding, and ones that don't. And so there's a number of buildings. I think I was talking with Gordon White, the integrated resources manager at Point Reyes last summer, and he was saying, I think it was even the lighthouse has been, some aspects of its repair have been on a wait list for funding for over a decade. Because it's just not the sexy thing that the Park Service needs to fix right now. So I think there's a lot, that movement from reservation onto permits just brings enormous amounts of uncertainty in a lot of different arenas. It makes it harder to operate and harder to look forward into the future.
John or Paul, anything you wanted to add there?
There might have been more historic properties at one point, but one of the first, I forget if it was Binuis or Arbinger, the first superintendents at Point Reyes, once the National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966, was quoted as saying on the properties where they had already purchased, and there were farm buildings, farm barns, houses, his quote was, "Let's burn these old barns down before the historians find them."
Well, and similarly, I think under Sansing, the park staff routinely referred to his historic preservation policy as the D8 policy, because that's the model of Caterpillar tractor they had to knock them over with.
It's almost forgotten these days, but there was actually quite a brisk fight around the 25th anniversary of the seashore in this general period when the reservations of use were running out. There was a faction of the environmental community which was very critical of the continuation of the ranching and of conditions on ranches, and it did not happen without a lot of friction. Then that hump was gotten over to prepare the way for the next one.
Very good. I do want to open it up to everybody, so as you get ready with your questions, let me go ahead and clear the air. There's a little thing of a lawsuit. And as we have these workshops, that lawsuit is not something our speakers and our guests are really prepared to talk about, or that we can even know enough detail to handle. There is hopes and aspirations that whether it's a ranch comprehensive management plan or a general management plan, that as we work through these workshops, the uncertainties and the needs for that kind of blueprint will clear up the uncertainty around, say, elk, or how do you keep and maintain barns. So please, with your questions, just be respectful of that as we move forward over our meetings of the 4 Tuesdays that we come together, that there might be some questions where we just have to respectfully say we're not going to answer that because we don't know the answer. And again, we're not prepared. That wasn't why we did this. We did this way in advance of the lawsuit so that we could learn about the Ranch Comprehensive Management Plan together. So, so hopefully that's helped you know how MCL is orientated to things and how we're ready to give you the chance to talk to the panelists. So with that, yeah, please. Yeah.
I think one thing we can say about the lawsuits, though, is that the media coverage of them, it shows how people will reach back to the creation and pick up the points that they think support their argument. Because you'll
Amen.
see that from both directions, whether it's for everything wilderness to support ranches, don't make any changes. People will reach back and say, well, it was meant to be this, exactly. It was meant to be that. And I think as we've talked about, there's a lot of ambiguity at the beginning because there's many players involved in creating a national park site and also in managing a place like that, as well as working and living in a place like that.
Never trust a simple story.